Welcome, viewers, to a journey through NYC Religions Television. I'm your host, Tony Carnes. Today, we have Reverend Rich Villodas with us, who's going to talk about his new book, The Deeply Formed Life, and about him growing up in East New York, and about his assessment of where are we going as a church in the late 2020. Rich, welcome to the show.
Tony, so good to be here. Look forward to a good conversation.
You know, New York City is like a pomegranate of religions, and there almost every variety you want. It's sort of, I call it the big pomegranate. And in that, there's lots of cross-fertilization going on. I ran across one of these examples of cross-fertilization a couple of years ago when I heard you were going to be speaking in Manhattan at a church in Manhattan with Reverend John Tyson. And we were doing a journey, and I thought, well, let's go by and visit. And I remember Reverend Tyson was a little bewildered that I was greeting you, but what was interesting is how both of you, this cross-fertilization going on between churches and sometimes between different denominations and religions. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. Yeah, I do. Like it was yesterday. I remember that.
It was really delightful. And now, all of a sudden, this year, you both have books out.
Mm.
Now, he has a book called Beautiful Resistance, a very fine book. Its focus in many ways is how he has dealt with the pain of ministry and life in New York City. And he's sharing with people how he dealt with that. He's giving people hope they can get out of pain. Now, your book, The Deeply Formed Life, is sharing a lot about yourself and how you have arrived at a way of dealing with those things that you have. And if I can skip through some of the central core of the emotions you are dealing with in the book is a fear, anger, shame, and maybe the thing that is mentioned over and over maybe is the central part of your emotional life, but I'm not quite sure, and I want to ask you, is anxiety. Now, what would you say is the Reverend Tyson's, John's center is he's dealing with pain. Boy, he just feels that, and that's what he deals with. What do you see the center of your emotional life that you deal with most often and that you're being released from?
It's a great question, Tony. And in terms of that, I think it would be anxiety. And anxiety is this kind of automatic response to a threat, whether it is real or imagined. That's how I like to think about anxiety. And that came out of, I think, Murray Bowen, who was one of the founders of family systems theory, who I've read much from. So it is this automatic way of functioning and anxiety doesn't necessarily be as expressed in fear or timidity. Sometimes it's expressed in anger. Sometimes it's expressed in a need to control, manipulation, overworking. So anxiety has many different expressions, but it's often this automatic way of responding to a threat, whether real or imagined. And so that's kind of one of the go-to areas that I've received much help from over the years in trying to be a non-anxious presence in the world.
Now, in The Deeply Formed Life, you mentioned that you started dealing with some of these emotions quite early on as a kid in East New York, Pitkin Avenue area.
Yeah.
I've even visited your church there. That was, I think, has moved maybe since then. What kind of anxiety as a kid? Well, you know, I want to come to the anxiety in a moment. But as a kid, when did you first think about maybe there's a God?
Wow, it's a great question. When I first understood or began to wrestle with this notion of God was, I remember my parents were not churchgoers, but they would send me to church with my grandparents. and my aunts and aunts who lived within, within 2 blocks. There were probably 15 to 20 family members who lived nearby each other in East New York. And we would go to this small Spanish-speaking Pentecostal church. And my Aunt Lydia was the Sunday school teacher. And so my first conceptions of God were from her. And I would go to this church, not really understanding Spanish much. And so first of all, I grew up thinking Jesus was Puerto Rican.
All right.
To this day, I think he has some Puerto Rican blood in him. But I believe that God was holy. I believe that God was, there was a holiness, a sacredness when I walked in. So my grandfather would walk into the church, and the first thing he would do is get on his knees at the first pew he could find and pray. So there was a sacredness, a holiness. That was kind of my first conception of God as a 5, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, that this God was at any moment, you could be the meeting place of where the holy and the human converged. And so those are my first conceptions of God at a very early age.
Now that was quite early. Did you think of God even before you went to church, or only when you got there?
Only when I got to church, and I was, a kid who just wanted to play in the street and basketball and football with his friends. But it was when I got to church that I would think about God. It wasn't until I became well into my teens that I became a follower of Christ. But throughout my childhood, when I was in church from time to time, when my grandparents took me, that's really only when I thought about God.
Now, your parents, were they from Puerto Rico originally, or?
Yeah, my father's born in Boston, but his parents were born in Puerto Rico. My mother was born in Puerto Rico and in the western side of it, Mayagüez. And
Were they both from the western side, or?
Yeah, and
Same
my
town
mother,
or different towns?
a different town. But my mother moved over to Brooklyn when she was maybe 3 or 4 years old.
Right.
My father was born in Boston.
Oh, okay. So you're third generation, really?
Yeah.
That's quite remarkable. What town was your mom from?
Mayagüez.
Mayagüez. Oh, well, yeah, very famous.
Yeah.
And your father?
I'll have to remember. His father, his father, I think was Ponce.
Ponte. Okay. Well, for the first generation, that means a lot.
Mm-hmm.
For the second and third, not so much.
Right.
But being from Brooklyn means a lot. And you grew up in Brooklyn. And were there anxious moments in Brooklyn?
Well, Tony, I grew up in East New York. I'm 41 years old. I was born in 1979. And so in the 80s and 90s, East New York was one of the more under-resourced, overlooked, drug-infested, violent neighborhoods in all of New York City. And so I carried much anxiety. Lots of joy, lots of wonderful memories and experiences. But because of the violence that I saw day in and day out, it was also often very distressing to live in East New York, Brooklyn.
Was your block a safe block, or was it not a safe block?
It's funny you ask that, because I believe my block was the safest, but that's relatively speaking.
Right.
Where I was at on Pitkin Avenue and Elton Street, lots of people knew each other, although there was drug dealing happening in the corner. But compared to what was happening the next block over on Linwood or Essex Street, or on the other side, Warwick Street, those are pretty dangerous blocks. I mean, even a block would be very different. It's a different world. So for us, relatively speaking, it was safe, but that wasn't saying much.
It does give you, when you're on a safe block, particularly when you have friends or relatives, you do feel like you sort of got some shelter there.
Absolutely. And like I said, there were 15, 20 family members, and the neighbors were in very good contact with one another. We often played with each other's, the children played with one another. Right. So our block was truly a safe haven, but, that doesn't mean much when there's still lots of violence and things happening.
You have to go off the block sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right.
I lived on 153rd in Amsterdam, and my block was pretty safe.
Mm.
It was Puerto Rican who had bought their buildings, interesting enough, 1950s, and a few Dominicans. But man, we were in a sea of storm.
Mm.
So when you moved from one, you went from one block to the other, you took into account which block you were going down.
Very true. You knew which blocks to walk up and you knew which blocks not to walk down. So
Yeah, that's the first map you get of life. So of life, you've got a map that's sort of shaded darkly with anxiety and shaded gray with just medium anxiety.
yeah, absolutely.
And then you grew up, but you didn't stay in that church, though, did you? If I remember, you left at some point.
What happened was, and I'll keep this brief here. I was attending a small church called Bethel. That was when I was 5, 6, 7 years old.
Right.
And then around 9 through 12, there was a church called Ark of Salvation, Arca de Salvación.
Sure.
And it was that church that I would attend, but not for long. And because I asked my parents if I could stop going to church as a 12-year-old, they said yes, because I really wasn't getting anything out of it. Mm-hmm. I started attending a church in Queens, an Assemblies of God church in Queens, started dating a pastor's daughter.
Oh, which church?
There's a church called, it was Lighthouse Assembly of God in Glendale, Queens.
Right.
And that relationship didn't work out. And, you know, my heart was broken, came to Christ as a 19-year-old. And it was at that point where I returned to Arca de Salvación, because I became a Christian there, as did about 15 family members on one night in 1999 of August. My mother, my father, my brother, my 3 sisters, cousins, uncles, aunts, 15 of us in 1999. And so I attended Arca de Salvación there. And then from there, I went to Nyack College, and then kind of found myself in a couple of other churches before I landed at New Life.
Yes, you're now at New Life Fellowship, New Life Church in Queens. And it's a very multi-ethnic, multinational, large church. And it's not easy for a pastor to handle all of the different needs and desires and hopes and fears. But you have to deal with your own first. When you get anxious or you meet somebody in church that you think is going to criticize you, how do you deal with that? And how do you grow out of that? You know, when you have somebody come in and say, well, I didn't like the music today, or Pastor, what you preached today, I just don't, maybe I'm being polite, they might say, you know, this is what you should say.
Yeah.
That's, you're so, your products and your preaching's really great, but your products are so out of your personality that when somebody comes up to you with a comment, it's sort of like commenting on you. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that?
Well, this has been one of the, I think, important journeys I've been on. I've been in my role as the lead pastor for 7 years. I've been at New Life for 12 years, since 2008. And for your listeners, Tony, just, you know, we have 75 nations represented in our congregation. Political diversity, I would say, this is my own unofficial poll here, but I would say in 2016 and in 2020, I'd say 35 to 40% of our congregation voted for Donald Trump. I'd say 35 to 40% voted for Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton in 2016. I'd say probably 10% abstained, and probably another 10% wrote in someone else. And so not only is there ethnic diversity, there's political diversity, there's generational diversity, there's socioeconomic diversity. We have folks who've graduated from Ivy League schools, and we have folks who are who don't understand English well, and folks who are not necessarily well educated. I mean, you cannot, that just because you don't know English doesn't mean you're not educated. As I've met many folks who have immigrated here who are doctors in Kazakhstan, and now they can't, because of language barriers, they can't get a job here. But in light of all of that diversity, there in a given week, I'm hearing plenty of different opinions about something I've said, something that we're doing. How do I handle it? I have learned, Tony, there's a 5-step process and this is something that came to me some 5 years ago, and I write about it in the book, of navigating my own anxiety, especially when I recognize disproportionate responses in me to something. So I remember 2 years ago, I received a critique from a prominent national Christian leader who I really respect. And this person, I had posted a resource, and it was not harsh, it was not condescending, but it was someone who I really respect. And so I felt embarrassment that I could miss a particular angle of theology that I thought that I just missed it. And I realized I had been going through a time period of monitoring my own reactions, and I had developed a 5-step process that I have heard some things here and there, and I just synthesized it into this. These are 5 questions I ask myself whenever anxiety comes or disproportionate response to something happens. And it is this. Question 1, what happened? Question 2, what am I feeling? Question 3, what's the story I'm telling myself? Question 4, what's the gospel say? Question 5, what's the counter-instinctual act that's required of me? And very simply, this is how it worked through. What happened? A well-known leader criticized me. What am I feeling? Deep shame. What's the story I'm telling myself? I'll never be the kind of competent leader I hope to be. What's the gospel say? God has a way of using incompetent leaders. What's the counter-instinctual act that's required? For me, it was letting someone in so that I'm not going into my own journey and my own hole, but letting someone in that I can process with, whether it's my wife, whether it's a trusted friend, whether it's a counselor. And I started doing that process. And I tell you, it's not that I don't go into those holes anymore when criticism comes or difficult conversations are before me, but I don't go as deep as I used to, because I believe God is meeting me in that reflection and that kind of prayerful examination. So that's one of the ways that I've tried to meet anxiety head on when it surfaces in my life.
So what's the first question?
So it's what happened?
Okay, so the incident's quite straightforward.
Yep.
You got a constructive, I suppose, criticism.
Mm-hmm.
And is that how you identified it right away, or did you label it something?
Well, initially, because of the fragility of my own soul, I didn't see it through the lens of positive critique. I just emphasized criticism is coming. And it wasn't until I stepped back and got out of my own kind of emotionality and reactivity that I was able to say, this person was being very generous and kind with me. And
so the second step is what?
The second is, what am I feeling?
So what did you feel? It's interesting. You felt shame?
I felt shame, and here's why, Tony. For me, I take lots of pride, and in a good way and a bad way, I suppose, in knowing. I want to read every book. I want to know every theory. And so if I don't know something, and of course, only God is omniscient, but if I don't know something, especially something that I think by this time I should have known that, for whatever reason, that hits a part of my own soul, of my own inadequacy. And so in that context there, because I didn't know it, I felt ashamed that why shouldn't I have known it by now? And so, for different people, it might be different things, but for me in that context, for me, it was a reflection. I'm not a good leader because by this time I should have already known this.
So it was, you felt ashamed. And on the other hand, you can't know everything.
Mm-hmm.
You have a tension, perhaps, that you mentioned in your book, that you'd like to get things done, let's go. But at the same time, you got to take time to know something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how do you, I'm just going to do a little detour to that. How do you handle that tension of sort of wanting to get things over with and versus your sort of perfectionism or desire to really master something?
Yeah, I think the way that I think I try to navigate through that is I have found, where I'm sitting right now is my kind of prayer chair and reflection chair. I'm in my bedroom here, and this is an important space for me where I spend a lot of time in introspection here. I have my journal right next to me. And so I think this is the space where I'm honest about my own motives and longings and shortcomings and sins. This is the place where it's often I'm able to get some form of clarity about my own need to know something by now, the slow work of leadership, the slow work of an unfolding work of following Christ in this world. So that's helpful. And additionally, I often need people outside of me to help me as I process. And so I meet with 3 other pastor friends monthly who are in very similar church settings in terms of size, in terms of the level of pressure that they're facing in a given week. Having to lead a number of people to follow Christ and love one another and not get caught up in the hostility of our culture. So having that kind of support has been invaluable to help me manage and navigate some of those tensions that you just mentioned.
When you started processing emotions, how did you identify it was shame? Was it so clear that it was shame, or did you say, well, is it really shame? Is it something else? How did you process and get down that to really say, oh, that's what I'm really feeling?
Yeah, there's been some folks who have been helpful in trying to delineate guilt and shame. So guilt is like, I've done something wrong. Shame is I am wrong. I am something wrong. I am is not that I just don't have a gap of knowledge here. It's as a human being, I'm deficient and there's something wrong here. I think part of it is because it's been a storyline of my life that God has helped me with significantly, it's easy for me to identify. And shame is often rooted to, enoughness. I'm not enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not handsome enough. I'm not eloquent enough. I'm not whatever enough. And so for me, because it's been, a journey of discovery and healing, for me, that's where it landed, that I was able to say, yeah, this is not just fear. It's not just disappointment. It's something that's hitting deeper in my soul. And the word that came up for it was just shame.
Now, is this a feeling that you experienced when you were a kid?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for various circumstances, there were, whether it was I didn't make the basketball team, whether I disappointed a family member, whether harsh words were spoken to me by someone, a sense of my not enoughness, that I'm not lovable. And I grew up in a family that was very loving, but, we all have, at least I did, some of those experiences where shame, came my way. So, but yeah, I mean, I think we all do to some degree, but certainly what I'm experiencing, the battles that I wage today in my own soul didn't just happen yesterday. These things have been building for decades. The stories that I tell myself, the encounters that I have, the failures that I've experienced. So I like to think this is a long battle, and I don't know if I'll ever be done with it, but I like to think that I don't go into the hole of shame as deep as I used to. And that
now, that's the third. Then the third step was what?
What's the story I'm telling myself? So it's what am I feeling, and what's the story I'm telling myself?
That's one thing you talk about a lot, that we put ourselves in a story.
Yeah.
And those stories stick with us, right?
Yeah.
They tend to repeat.
Yeah, there's the story we tell ourselves is like, it's the tape that's running over and over in our head. It's the open loop. that we don't have to give much thought to it. It's in our subconscious. And when an event comes, that story often just plays immediately. And I believe the story often is not, again, back to like enoughness. I am not this enough, whatever that blank is. That's a big story that we tell ourselves. And those stories need to be combated. As a Christian, as a pastor, I believe that within the gospel story, the gospel of grace, it is that story that must supersede and combat every other story that comes our way, which is why that fourth question is, what does the gospel say? Which requires us to know something about Christ, something about the New Testament, something about the way of Jesus and the love of God. So that's why it's that fourth question. What does the gospel say in light of the stories that we tell ourselves?
Now, is the gospel story, when you put yourself in that, is that really enough to displace the other story? Or you just add one, and sometimes you do one. On Saturday night, you do the shame. On the Sunday morning, you do gospel. I'm joking, of course, but
no, I think it's a great question. And I think this is why in my book, I just don't talk about theology. I'm talking about various practices to help us live into that new reality and live into that theology, because this is more than just an intellectual thing where I could intellectually assent to the good news of the gospel. But if I'm not trying to reorder my life in such a way that helps me live into that, and so whether that is through prayer practices, whether that is through self-examination, whether that is through community life, those things we need often habits and practices to sustain the good news and the announcement of God.
So when you decided that you processed that you felt ashamed, that you were in a story of shame, being embarrassed for your not enoughness,
Mm-hmm.
and then you start to do a practice. How did you practice a new response to your critic? Well, actually we're running out of time, but that's what I think every reviewer should take a look at this book. It's called, what's it called again?
The Deeply Formed Life,
by Random House. We have Reverend Rich Villodas with us. It's a really terrific book. You'll read this and your life will change, which is what you can't say about every book. Thank you. My name is Tony Carnes. I'm with the Journey Through NYC Religious Television. Good day.